Good. Hi, I'm Jem. I'm another member of the STEP committee, and this is another episode of our STEP to Inspire podcast. I'm joined by Aaron, who's currently intercalating a DPhil in the middle of his medicine studies between the third and fourth year of the medicine course here. Thank you so much for joining us, Aaron, for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.
No, thank you. So my first question to you is, let's get right into it. Why did you decide to apply to study medicine at Oxford, and what was your application journey like?
Yeah, so I'm not one of these that can claim they were born knowing they wanted to do medicine. That certainly wasn't my journey. And I know a lot of people sort of claim they knew from they were being 6 years old that they wanted to do medicine. That certainly wasn't me. I think I started off wanting to be, when I was five, chancellor. That was my goal because I liked maths at school. And then I quickly realized that being chancellor wasn't much maths. And then I wanted to do law and then probably didn't do the right A levels. I think when I was at school, it was quite uncommon for boys to do humanities subjects. So we were sort of pushed down the maths and sciences route. So I did A levels in maths, biology, chemistry, and physics. Realized I like science, and I guess then that raised the possibility of doing medicine. And then pursued work experience. Actually, I did do work experience in year 11 in a GP practice. So I guess by then I was already thinking about applying to medicine. And then I actually ended up flipping a coin between medicine and physics in the summer of year 12 before applying. And it landed on tails. And that was medicine. That was assigned medicine. And then, yeah, I ended up applying to medicine. And what is it, 7, 8 years later,
Wow.
we're still here.
That's great. That's quite an unconventional route by the sounds of it. And what was the kind of, how did you find, the interview process and the application tests, all that kind of thing? How was that for you?
Yeah, so the interview process, I guess, is broadly similar. The application test, or the admissions test rather, has somewhat changed. So it was back then it was the BMAT, which I understand it's now the UCAT at Oxford and Cambridge, but I did do both because I obviously didn't just apply to Oxford. So I actually preferred the BMAT. I think it's a bit of a shame that it's gone. I think it does test quite different skills to the UCAT. But the UCAT, I'm not sure of its direct relevance to medicine, but I understand that they do have to assess candidates in an objective way and a way that you can't necessarily prepare for too much. So yeah, I did both. But obviously for me, the BMAT was the kind of dominant the test I needed for Oxford. The interview process it was terrifying. It was in person. This was before COVID. It was in
Wow.
2018, and we all sort of came down to Oxford the night before, and then I applied to Wadham and I was interviewed at Wadham and St Hilda's. Two interviews at each college, two people in each, so 8 people in total. And I think that I started off with the sort of sciences one, and that was, they eased us into it with asking us to draw amino acids, and then moved quite quickly into things that I had very little idea about, drawing titration curves. And I think we all fumbled through it that year. And I think when I spoke to them afterwards, I don't think any of us got it right. But the point wasn't necessarily to get it right. The point was very much to see how you think and and really trying to assess how well you can be taught. But yeah, it was a scary process. But looking back on it, it was certainly overall, I guess, a fun process. It was nice to come down to Oxford, and some of the people I met that day or over those 2 days, I guess, were people that ended up staying or getting offers here, and it was nice to then keep in touch with them over that sort of period.
Mm.
But and what I would say as well is, it's thinking from the other side of it. I now lecture in physiology at Wadham, and one of the questions I was asked in my interview for the job was designing a question. Basically, part of the job is the admissions process, and one of the questions was to sort of, what question would you ask a student? And actually, that's really tough, because what you want to ask is a question that you can't necessarily prepare for, a question that assesses potential and enthusiasm without alienating people immediately. So you can't ask something that they would have never heard of, because then there's no way in. And thinking it from the other way, I think, can actually be a good way to think about preparing for the interviews, because if you can think, well, if you were designing a question to interview, what would you want to assess and how would you go about assessing it? That was really beneficial when applying for when sitting the interviews, rather, because you can sort of flip the card and think about what would they want to see, and then kind of reverse engineer a question from that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and it sounds like your experience is quite a universal one then of like going in there, they test your basic science knowledge and then show you something which you have no idea about. You inevitably get it quite wrong, but you kind of have a fun experience of it. So I think that sounds exactly like what happened to me as well, to be honest. Um, so and then when you kind of got it to doing preclinical medicine here, how did you find that? What was your experience of that like?
So I loved it, and I think that's probably why I'm still doing a PhD and not finishing off the clinical course. Well, I should be finished last year, but no, I really enjoyed it, and I think that's for me that's what sets Oxford and Cambridge apart. It's the sort of deep depth or deep dive into the science that you wouldn't ordinarily have elsewhere. I really enjoyed, particularly the third year. Lots of people hate third year. I loved third year. I thought it was great to be able to engage in a bit more detail with topics and not to kind of have that pressure of churning out an essay 3 times a week and moving on and then not thinking too much about a topic again. I enjoyed that time to really think a bit more detail about a specific topic, which essentially is what a PhD is. Is 4 years thinking about one topic rather than a week. And I really enjoyed it, and I thought you obviously gain a lot of knowledge in the preclinical course that you perhaps don't use day to day in medicine or in clinical medicine. And I didn't necessarily want all of that to be wasted. While it was in my mind, I thought, well, I could certainly use this and pursue research a little bit further. I had a really good FHS project. So I was with Professor Kim Dora and Chris Garland down in vascular pharmacology, and had a really good experience with them. And Kim sort of suggested to me that, oh, you could apply for this PhD. And at the time, I thought, well, there's no way, I don't want to make a 6-year degree, a 10-year degree. And I gave it some thought and then ended up applying. I didn't apply to any other PhDs. I wasn't necessarily set on the PhD route, but I did apply to the one that she was organising at the time, and then got on. And then, yeah, spent the last 4 years now thinking a lot of detail about one specific topic.
Yeah, and that's kind of taken my next question away a bit, but what exactly is that topic and what has your experience of doing that been like? Have you enjoyed it?
Yeah, so a PhD is fundamentally different from medical school. It's you don't have lectures, you're not necessarily taught anything. They call you a student, of course, and I guess you are learning, but it's a very different type of learning to what you would be doing on the course. It's a so my PhD was in my PhD course is cardiovascular science, but I focus specifically on structural remodeling, so fibrosis and scarring of the heart in the context of atrial fibrillation. So a lot of the current therapies for atrial fibrillation, for people that are listening and not heard of atrial fibrillation is a rhythm disturbance that affects the heart's upper chambers. It's the most common sustained cardiac arrhythmia and affects about 1% of the population. So it's a pretty common disease. And if you talk to your parents, grandparents, ask their friends, someone's probably got atrial fibrillation because aging is the major risk factor. It's not it's unlikely to cause you serious damage in itself, but it massively increases your risk of things like heart failure and strokes, and that's why we really care about it. And the current treatments for it either look to go in interventionally and ablate the kind of electrical circuits which are driving the disease, or you can take drugs that interfere with the electrical pathways, ion channel modulators or beta blockers. But there's no current therapy which targets that fibrosis and structural remodeling process. So my PhD was really trying to understand what drives that fibrosis, and I was particularly interested in the calcitonin receptor signaling axis. So calcitonin is a hormone produced by the thyroid gland, and is conventionally thought of as a hormone that regulates systemic calcium homeostasis. But our group showed a few years ago that it was produced by the heart, and in the heart it acts to suppress fibrosis. And in AF, in patients with AF, that signaling axis is disrupted. So my PhD was trying to work out, first of all, why it's disrupted, and secondly, how can we fix it to ultimately restore the signaling axis and suppress the fibrosis. And we've made some progress. We've got a few drugs now which look very promising, and we're now testing them in mice to see whether they will have that beneficial effect that we see in our cells.
That's really incredible, actually. So, do you perceive yourself having kind of like continuing with that group in some shape or form, or continuing with what you started on this PhD down the line,
Yeah,
given it's like the start of such an early like drug development process by the sounds of it?
Yeah, so I mean, basically the screening, I screened over 3,000 drugs in three different patients and then identified one which looks really promising. That's now been moved to Baylor College of Medicine, Professor Xander Verens, who's doing the animal work on this study, so testing it in vivo. And then ultimately, if the in vivo data is promising, the next stage would be to look at small clinical trials. Obviously, that at the moment is beyond my expertise, and that's when you have to start bringing in collaborators to help you organize that. But it would be fantastic to see, by the time I got to clinical practice, if you could see this, because it's a drug that's widely used in cardiovascular disease already, so it can be rapidly repurposed. So it's something that you could potentially get into patients quite easily if you get it through those early phases of clinical trials. So, I mean, lab work is very time consuming. It's very difficult, I think, to do a huge amount of lab work alongside clinical school. Because once you start a cell experiment, you have to be in every day to look after the cells. And it's, when you're on placements and things, it's a little bit more difficult. But I certainly will be, finishing up the papers from my PhD with the group. Hopefully we get some really exciting in vivo data from the US and then start to bring in people that might have more expertise in clinical trials. That's the sort of next steps. So it's a nice time, really. I guess it's naturally evolving into bringing in more people anyway.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned kind of the third year of the degree, the FHS side of things, kind of setting you up for what you then went on to do. More broadly, what was your transition from preclinical school to doing the PhD like for you, and how do you think, the preclinical experience set you up?
So it was a very, very steep learning curve. I think especially if you do a wet lab project. I mean, I'd done my FHS project, which is the third year research project, and had spent, well, 8 weeks officially, but probably substantially more in the lab developing a fluorescent dye which could report nitric oxide. But all of this was sort of cell-free. We weren't using. We did test it a little bit in rat mesenteric arteries, but that was with a PhD student at the time. So when I came into the lab myself to do a PhD and suddenly was culturing cells and all the kind of molecular biology with its PCRs, Western blots, um, all of this kind of stuff was brand new, and I had to learn really quickly because I don't think we don't do a huge amount of practical stuff in the medical degree, especially compared to people that are coming on from other courses. So most people that have done a PhD, it's very unusual to come straight from a bachelor's. Usually you would have done a master's by research and you'll have developed, quite a lot of experience before coming into PhD. So you're familiar with those basic techniques. So that part was really tough, coming into a PhD, never having done a PCR or a Western blot or culturing cells meant that the first year was very much just learning. But fortunately for me, my program was a 4-year program. So that first year was actually spent just kind of rotating round groups and doing 3 sort of mini rotations. And that was really good because I got to see how lots of different groups worked while learning lots of different techniques. And it meant that when I started my PhD, I had some idea what I was doing. I mean, after 4 years, I'm still not entirely sure I know what I'm doing, but I have a little bit more of an idea than I did then.
That's good. Yeah. I like the sound of that kind of rotation thing. I think that sounds quite similar to what we do a lot of the time in clinical medicine as well, just kind of trying out lots of different things. And then just thinking about kind of the maybe the reverse of that question, how do you think your experience doing the PhD in the last 4 years is going to shape your kind of future career in medicine and the next 3 years for you?
Yeah, so I think you do. I think you certainly learn skills during a PhD, which you don't develop during medical school. So I think certainly the kind of research techniques, obviously, is something that you can develop and you can take those to another lab and you can do similar experiments. But I think much more than that, kind of, designing experiments to address a question essentially is basically, I think, as far as I'm concerned, what a PhD is all about. It's learning how to design something to tackle a question that you've got. And that doesn't really matter whether your question is something cell-based or something sort of clinical trial-based. Being able to sort of critically appraise data and critically appraise research is important in whatever kind of field you're in. And I think, I have spent a long time doing that. And obviously, I've done quite a lot of teaching during my PhD, so I'll be continuing that into clinical school, and that's something I really enjoy. And I think that's always good fun because you think you understand something, and then you have to come and teach it, and suddenly you realize you don't understand it as well as you thought. So that keeps you on your toes trying to teach. And I think so. Yeah, I think that there'll be bits of research and certainly bits of teaching, which my PhD has prepared me for, which I'm looking forward to keeping up during clinical school.
Yeah, definitely. And on the kind of teaching role that you had, how did you get into that? What was the kind of story there?
Yeah, but my current role is I'm a lecturer in physiology and pharmacology at Wadham. So I take over the sort of teaching in the first year for physiology and pharmacology,
Mm.
setting the collections, doing the tutorials for them, and then some of the admission stuff when that comes round in December. So the way to get into it. So first of all, the it's a little bit opportunistic that the vacancy has to be there. Most colleges have already got tutors, right? And in my case, what happened was the professor, the fellow who was covering that teaching, was appointed to a university level position. He went to be senior proctor for a year, so his job was advertised, and then I'd applied through it, and then was interviewed. But obviously, to apply for those roles, you need evidence of it teaching. So it's so to get that, so supervising FHS students was one. So I had an FHS student who was great and did a really good project. I also started asking the tutors at the college if I could take over some of their tutors that fell within my expertise. So there's a fellow at Wadham who does the pathology teaching, who's a cancer biologist, and obviously in pathology in second year you do atherosclerosis.
Yeah.
So I took over the atherosclerosis tubes for the last couple of years. So that's another way to gain a bit of experience. And then I do a lot of kind of teaching of GCSE and A level, whether that's for various access initiatives and also privately. So I built up a bit of experience in teaching because you have to have some experience before you can apply for a sort of fixed term position or a stipendiary position at a college. Um, but yeah, it's something I really enjoy, and it also means that again I don't forget it. So it's I don't know how much I'll have to think about the sort of mathematical modelling of the membrane potential in clinical school, but it's having once learnt it, it feels a shame
Yeah,
to completely forget it.
definitely. I bet it's really properly consolidated now, you know,
Yeah.
all of that. And then kind of a bit of like a two-pronged question. If you were to give any advice to any of the younger students applying now who are considering applying, what advice would you give them, kind of both as someone who has done a little bit on the admission side of things, but also as someone who where it was in their position, 7 or 8 years ago?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to show enthusiasm. And I think people say, oh, how do you do this? And I think if you're naturally interested in the subject, you're reading about it widely, you're coming across things that you can bring up in interviews. Don't force things in. That's almost the worst when people bring in something that's got nothing to do with the question they're being asked. But if you've read and you're coming across lots of things, these are all things you can draw upon in the interview, and you'll naturally bring them up, and that passion will come across. And I think practicing that is really important. So get used to talking about, whether it's an article you've read in the news with family or friends, or whether it's a new discovery. So whatever the Nobel Prize was that year, that's a good place to start. And just get used to talking about things that you don't know very much about. I think because that's essentially, what the interview is going to be. It's going to be talking about something which you're not familiar with. And working, get a group of you that are all applying to medicine together and work together in preparing. And I think that's something during medical school as well that I found really, really helpful, is that we always worked. There was a group of us that, would share essays, whether it was at Wadham or across the whole universities, that would share essays, share essay plans, share sort of flashcards that we made. And we all did very well in the exams. And this wasn't because we were better than other students. It's just that we'd work together, and we'd split up the kind of work between us, and sort of work smarter, not harder, if you like. And I think you can apply that same idea to preparing for your interviews as well. You're not in direct competition with the person next to you. It's
Mm. Yeah, and I definitely think that's a theme that carries on into med school as well, and even further as a doctor. Like they talk about it a lot, but teamwork and like the kind of camaraderie between you, like you said, you're not in direct competition with each other, so everyone can kind of help excel and propel each other forward. I think is really, really important. Is there anything that you wish you had known when you were kind of applying?
yeah. So I think. I think people get almost in the trap of thinking that it's all about knowledge and how much you know. And I think I almost drove myself mad trying to just read everything and like try and come across everything. Obviously, this is entirely impossible. There's no way that you can cover everything that could possibly come up in the interview. So I think focusing on depth in things you're genuinely interested in, rather than trying to sort of read around things that, might come up, is probably a better strategy and probably better for your mental health and sanity than trying to read everything that could possibly come up. And I think tutors, if they get the sense that they know what they ask a question, you know a lot about the topic, they'll just move on. So I think
Definitely.
natural interest, let that direct your reading and your focus rather than trying to impress something on something that you're not genuinely interested in.
Yeah, exactly. I'd heard that quite a few times as well, that like they're never trying to assess how much you know about something which you kind of like might know a lot about. If they sense that, they'll move on quite quickly. So yeah, I think the only thing you can have the knowledge about is like your A-level curriculum, and then the
Mhm.
little niche things which you might personally find interesting. But beyond that, like you said, it's not worth having like an encyclopedic knowledge of the entirety of medical science. That's not going to get you
I mean, you don't need
anywhere.
to go to university at that point if you already know
Yeah,
it all. There's no point admitting
exactly.
them.
Yeah, definitely. And so I guess my last question to you is, are you kind of excited for the next chapter of your education? Like, are you excited to start clinical school in a few months? How's that process going?
I'm excited to finish my PhD.
Yeah.
I'm excited to get that behind me and write up this small book and get that out. Um, I am excited to go to clinical school. My PhD, there was parts of it which were quite clinical. So we ran a couple of research studies, and all of our samples that I work with, I get from patients undergoing cardiac surgery. So I do spend quite a lot of time in cardiac surgery, going and consenting patients. And actually, that was the part of my PhD I enjoyed the most. It was talking to the patients down on the ward on an evening, and I was consenting them and taking a history. Um, and people said to me when I started my PhD, they said, "There's no way you'll come back to clinical medicine." And I said, "No, I definitely will. I definitely will." I wasn't 100% sure at the time that I was telling the truth, but actually, because that's the part I've enjoyed the most, I actually really am looking forward to it. And as interesting as cells are, I think patients are more interesting to talk to, and looking after cells. And
Yeah.
it'll be a bit strange reintegrating into a new year. But I think apart from that, it should be good fun, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great sign if the part you liked the most was the patient contact, even when you were kind of surrounded by cells and stuff like that. I think that's a good predictor. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I think it's super helpful for people applying to see all of the different things that you can do from studying medicine here. So yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting and inspiring. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.